Guys, Boxing Gossip here, and I've got another video for you. First and foremost, before we get into it, I can see I've had quite a few new subscribers in the past week, so if you're new to the channel, shout out to you. Many thanks for joining. I'm really trying to build things out this year, so if you're one of those people who watches the videos regularly, please do take the time to subscribe and help me expand the channel. I wanted to make another video on Chris Eubank Jr. and it wasn't my intention to do another video on Chris Eubank Jr. But ever since starting this channel, I've always had the mindset that I want to make videos that people want to listen to. If I watch a fight that I find particularly entertaining, if I go to a bill at your call that I want to review, I will happily do that in the full knowledge that very few people are going to click on it and view it. You know, it doesn't bother me. But at the same time, I am mindful that I want to do something that people are interested in. And one thing I've got to say is that love him or hate him, and a fair people fall into the hate him category, Chris Eubank Jr. is becoming one of the most talked about characters in the sport. He, alongside his father, are certainly both Marmite personalities, if you like. But realistically, they're generating a huge amount of intrigue and a huge amount of interest amongst the general boxing population. And I've got to say, in the last week or so, I've been inundated with questions and requests to further discuss the Eubanks. Now, last night on the podcast, we do the podcast every Wednesday at 8:30. We had a fairly extended discussion about the Eubank and the Eubank's performance. It's about Chris Eubank and about his performance in his fight against Reynold Quinlan. And moving on from that, I had all sorts of messages asking me to do a sort of detailed breakdown as to how I see his fights going if he steps into the ring with James Degale, George Groves, Callum Smith, etc, etc. Now at this point in time, all of those fights are kind of pie in the sky. You know, the Eubanks have really made their name over the last few fights fighting a far lower level of opposition than that. There's some debate as to whether they'll be at 160 or 168. There's some debate as to whether they're only going to fight on ITV, and you know that may potentially exclude the Sky fighters or the Box Nation fighters as potential opponents. I guess we'll kind of have to see how it plays out. But even if these fights don't go down, I certainly think the discussion as to how the fights will go is something that's generating intrigue and interest amongst the boxing population. You know, if we look back at the British boxing scene, there's a lot of fights in divisions that should happen but haven't happened. I guess an obvious one is Callum, but even more than that, you know, you look at the UK heavyweight scene 18 months ago, David Haye, Joshua, Tyson Fury, you know, big names. Look at the middleweight scene a few years ago, Martin Murray, Andy Lee, Matthew Macklin, Darren Barker. You know, those four guys always sort of linked together. And now we've got another situation like that, I believe, in the middleweight division, in the super middleweight division. You've got James Degale, the WBC super middleweight champ, who a fair proportion of fans have as the number one 168 pounder in the world. You've got George Groves, who enjoyed perhaps the highest profile fight of all of these guys when he took on Carl Frotz in a rematch at Wembley Stadium. He also has wins over James Degale, as you guys know. Win in the amateur, win in the pros. Callum Smith, the Sky prospect, who, you know, Eddie Hearn is certainly hyping as the next big thing. And Chris Eubank Jr., who's recently thrown his hat into the ring with an IBO World Championship win against Reynold Quinlan. So, for me, those are the four guys in the super middleweight mix at present in Britain. And I actually think those fights out there are super fights. I think those are fights that are truly going to capture the public's imagination and are going to raise the profile of these fighters and the sport in general in the UK. You know, if these fights were to get made, if all of those guys were to face each other, I genuinely believe that the amount of tickets, the amount of pay-per-views, etc. that have been sold would take the sport to new heights at present, you know, within this country. I really do believe that to be the case. So, first and foremost, it could be a great time for boxing. Let's hope these fights get made. But I wanted to get into it now because I actually think all of these fights are actually pretty tough to call the winner in. There's certainly fighters I'd make favourite in all of the fights, and we'll come on to that in a bit more detail. But I think one of the interesting things about these 4 fighters is all of them have immeasurable strengths. But for me, they're all fighters who have chinks in their armour, or weaknesses, or areas of improvement. It depends how you want to phrase it. Let's start with James Degale. For me, out of the 4 guys, James Degale is the most skilled. He's got the best amateur pedigree, an Olympic gold medalist nonetheless. He's been considered the top guy in the sport at £168 for the past year or so. He's got some real formidable wins on his resume. Andre Durrell, Lucien Boutte. There's good form there. The win against the draw against Badu Jack, even though that was a controversial decision, is still a high level of form. But Degale's got weaknesses to his game. Defensively, against Badu Jack, he was more frail than I anticipated. On the inside, against Badu Jack, he was less dominant than I anticipated. On the outside, he failed to use his jab and box from the outside. I think he landed something like 4 or 5 jabs in the entire fight. But his fatal flaw is is his tendency to fade mid-fight. His tendency to take time off during the fight and maybe drift out of contention for 3 or 4 rounds in the middle of fights. That's James Degale's fatal flaw. George Groves, again, huge strengths. Arguably the biggest puncher out of the 4. The guy who, for my money, has the best jab in British boxing, pound for pound right now, George Groves. A real explosive fighter who on his day is legit top level. But George Groves has flaws in his game, doesn't he? Like James Degale, there's some question over stamina. He's not a fighter who tends to finish fights strongly. He's a fighter who tends to fade, typically towards the back end of fights. There's always been punch resistance concerns and durability concerns with George Groves. Ever since in his prospect stage he was dropped by Kenny Anderson. We saw him knocked spark out by Carl Frotz in their second fight. We saw him worn down and sort of beaten out of there in the first fight by Carl Frotz. So George Groves, very talented, very explosive, very dynamic from the outside. But again, are there fatal flaws in his game? Callum Smith, a guy with a tremendous upside, truly a monster at the weight, the rangiest, scopiest guy out of the 4 competitors, a guy who's a tremendous body puncher, a guy who's completely unbeaten, but at the same time is his weakness that he really is yet to step it up against any level of opposition. I guess his biggest win in his career to date is Rocky Fielding. There's concerns about the fact that he is perhaps not the most versatile operator. Is he a bit stiff? Is he a bit clinical? Bit robotic? Bit predictable? What's he going to do when somebody takes his distance away from him and forces him into a bit of a scrap? How will his power and skills translate to the upper echelons of the division? There's unknowns. As for Chris Eubank Jr., for me, one of the most stylish fighters you're likely to see. A beast on the inside and in the pocket. A high volume fighter with a tremendous work rate and engine and ability to put combination punches together. Is he vulnerable defensively? Is he truly a super middleweight? Does he carry the power necessary for £168? Is he too easy to box long and box from range? Is he susceptible to a jabbing opponent? Lots of questions with all these guys. And I think that's why, for me, this is such an interesting dynamic within the division. Very, very plausible to make a case for all 4 of these men. But also very plausible to see how they can be beaten, how their weaknesses can be exploited, and how potentially they could struggle against each other. And for me, that's what makes these fights so entertaining and makes the potential for these fights to succeed so exciting, because there isn't that predictability. A lot of the pay-per-view fights in the UK at present, they're pay-per-view because there's a superstar headliner like Anthony Joshua, yeah, I mean that's the main reason at present that we have pay-per-view in the UK, is because the superstar headliners like Joshua and the pay required to make the fights means that pay-per-view is going down. As Irish Tom pointed out on my podcast, it's actually fairly rare that you get one of these pay-per-view fights that are 50-50. Joshua Klitschko is one that is 50-50. Frampton Quigg is what could be classed as a 50-50 fight. You may or may not disagree that it's 50-50, but regardless, take the point, it's a competitive fight. Cleverly Bellew, a much derised pay-per-view that people take the mick out of, but let's be honest, that was a legit 50-50 going into that fight as well. So I think that's what these fights bring to the table that a lot of other pay-per-views don't. There's a legit competition. These are fights that could go either way. There's going to be supporters. The Eubanks are going to have their supporters. Degale's going to have his supporters. Callum Smith's got his followers, etc. But realistically, no matter what side of the coin you sit on, you would have to admit that there are ways for both men to win if you throw in any combination of these four fighters into a fight. And there are also ways for all of those men to lose as well, which makes it particularly intriguing. But for the purposes of the rest of this video, we're going to focus on Chris Eubank Jr. versus these three opponents. And we're going to start by looking at Eubank Jr. versus Callum Smith. Two guys who I would suggest are at a closer stage in their professional careers so far. Degale, Groves, let's have it right. These are guys who have been operating at a higher level. Groves has obviously fought Carl Frost, Badu Jack, James Degale himself. James Degale's fought George Groves, Andre Durrell, Lucien Boutte, Badu Jack. These are guys who are operated at a higher level. So let's start by talking Eubank Jr. versus Callum Smith. And for me, these are two guys who I've always been slightly dubious over on their way up. These are guys who I've never completely bought into the hype that their promoters and fans are trying to sell them as. For me, if you look at it on a sort of tail of the tape basis, Callum Smith would have obvious advantages over Chris Eubank Jr. Number one, a size advantage. Eubank Jr. for me is a small 168 pounder. Callum Smith is a monster at 168 pounds. Eubank Jr. is a guy who's made his living being the big man in fights, particularly at middleweight. He's someone who imposes himself on opponents by using his size and strength. Would he be able to do that against Callum Smith? Callum Smith is also a fighter who likes to fight long, at range, and he's effective behind a jab and behind classic outside boxing. For me, that's when Eubank looks at his weakest. A lot of guys have success against Chris Eubank from range. Guys like Tom Doran, guys like Reynold Quinlan. Callum Smith is going to have that ability to box him from range. But unlike those guys, Callum Smith seems to be a much harder puncher. And Callum Smith, I do believe, has superior punching power to Chris Eubank Jr. as well, especially at 168 pounds. So if you look at it on a tail of the tape basis, Callum Smith's the favourite. He's the bigger guy. He's unbeaten. He boxes in a way that could potentially cause Eubank Jr. problems with his long range game and his jab, and he carries more power. However, boxing, as we know, isn't a game fought out on paper. And I have question marks over Callum Smith. As I've mentioned before, I kind of believe he's semi-predictable and he tends to fight in one way. He's a bit stiff, a bit robotic, and he's very, very structured in his approach. He's not a fighter whose work flows like a James Degale. He's more upright. And I think a guy like Chris Eubank Jr. potentially has just a ticket to deal with that. If you look at Callum Smith, very limited head movement, limited upper body movement, head straight up in the air. He's a guy who is very structured, very much fights behind certain constructs, and likes to have that outside distance, throw the jab, keep the guy at range, use his powerful right hand, his hooks to the body off that. Chris Eubank Jr. would look to take the space away from Callum Smith. Chris Eubank Jr. would look to get in his engine room, put him on his back foot, and these are questions that have yet to really be asked of Callum Smith in an effective manner. There's so many fighters out there who fight in that sort of outside boxing construct who don't really have very much at all if you manage to take the fight to their inside. Let me give some examples off the top of my head. Vladimir Klitschko, a guy who's very route one, never fights on the inside, never punches to the body, just likes to keep it at distance and at range behind the jab. David Price, well, we saw what happened to David Price only last weekend against Christian Hamer, when a guy could get inside of him and a guy could sit on his chest. There are many, many fighters who fall to pieces once their outside construct is breached and a fighter can take the fight to the inside. That's exactly what Chris Eubank Jr. would look to do against Callum Smith. And I've seen nothing in Callum Smith today that tells me conclusively he'd be able to deal with that. The way he fights, if I'm honest, is possibly tailor-made for a guy like Chris Eubank Jr. to get the decision over him, or to get a stoppage over him, because Callum Smith would be vulnerable once Eubank Jr. got inside the pocket. I believe he's stiff and upright. I don't believe he would necessarily be able to deal with Eubank's relentless uppercuts and pressure. And I think if Eubank Jr. succeeded in putting him into a defensive cell and potentially putting him on a back foot, I'm unclear how much game Callum Smith has in that arena. So for me, it's a very, very interesting fight. It's a fight that, on paper, favours Callum Smith. And stylistically, it's a tough one to call. Because the way Callum Smith boxes would potentially be kryptonite to Chris Eubank Jr. If Chris Eubank Jr. couldn't get inside of his jab. If Callum Smith can use his superior size, range and superior outside boxing ability to keep Eubank Jr. off him, I legit believe it will be target practice for Callum Smith. But my concern is that if Chris Eubank Jr. breaches that jab, and I suspect that he's a more dynamic, athletic mover than Callum Smith, who will be bobbing low and stepping to the side and using all sorts of techniques to get inside, then I think there's a chance Callum Smith absolutely falls to pieces and is rammed through by Chris Eubank Jr. on the inside. Let's say if this fight happened, I don't believe it would be a competitive fight. Legitimately, I'd struggle to pick a winner. I think the fight could easily end in stoppage for both guys. Eubank Jr. is supposed to have this great chin, and it's true we've never seen him hurt in a fight. But how many times have we seen him actually taken a punch from a proper power puncher? But I think this would be an easy win for either man, because if Callum Smith can keep Eubank Jr. off him, I don't see how it's a competitive fight. In Callum Smith's favour, that is. But if Eubank Jr. can breach those defences and get on the inside, then I don't think Callum Smith's got anything to deal with the Eubank assault. If I had to put a bet on it, if you're holding a gun to my head right now, I'd probably side 65-35 in favour of Chris Eubank Jr. I believe that Eubank Jr. has an athletic advantage, a speed advantage, and I think those are key in a fighter being able to move from the outside to the inside. I think if you're slow-footed, if you're ponderous, if you're someone who tires in fights, that transition of outside to inside is very, very difficult, especially when you've got a jab from a bigger man landing in your face over and over again. But with Eubank Jr.'s athleticism and speed, I suspect he'd be able to find that gap. And once he's in, I think Callum Smith would be very, very uncomfortable. And I don't think Callum Smith has proven the defensive capability in his career to date. to suggest that he can deal with a man like Chris Eubank Jr. on the inside. But as I say, it's a fight that legitimately could go both ways. Let's talk George Groves. In many ways, the George Groves fight is not dissimilar to the Callum Smith fight. Now, don't get me wrong, George Groves and Callum Smith are very, very, very different type of fighters. But if I was in the corner for those guys against Chris Eubank Jr., my advice to them would be to get their jabs pumping straight away and to keep the fight on the outside. Like Callum Smith, George Groves is a massive guy for 168 pounds, and George Groves is a guy who would enjoy a substantial size advantage over Chris Eubank Jr. I believe George Groves' jab is superior to Callum Smith's. As I've said already in this video, I believe George Groves pound for pound has the best jab in British boxing. I believe George Groves has a slight edge in power over Callum Smith. I believe he's probably got a slight edge in speed over Callum Smith. And I believe he's a slightly more dynamic fighter. Earlier how I was saying Callum Smith for me is a bit rigid. He doesn't have that sort of flow to his game. For me, George Groves has a more natural flow and rhythm to his boxing. It's not stiff, it's not structured as such. And George Groves is, because of that, an explosive, dynamic fighter. I think Groves would represent an even bigger threat to Chris Eubank Jr. than Callum Smith, because I think his outside boxing has even more to be feared. I believe he's a slightly more versatile puncher than Callum Smith. I believe he's got a wider range of effective punches and a good shot selection that he has at his disposal that gives him a broader arsenal of offence when put in comparison to Callum Smith. I also believe he's possibly a better mover than Callum Smith. We saw in the Degale fight, for example, how George Groves was adept at fighting on his back foot and picking off rounds, by scoring points and pot shotting on the back foot. I believe that kind of tactic would potentially be exceptionally successful against Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. is a guy who overcommits with his power punches. He lunges in, he's reckless, he's wild, at times he's inaccurate. That back foot game from a bigger man like George Groves with an outside arsenal that strong, he could be picking shots on Chris Eubank Jr. Very, very effectively if using that back foot style. I kind of believe if Chris Eubank Jr. were able to put Callum Smith on his back foot, the fight's over. I don't believe the same can be said if Chris Eubank Jr. could put George Groves on his back foot. I think George Groves, in addition to that increased offensive arsenal and in addition to that increased power, I think George Groves also has the ability to box on his back foot tidily and pick up rounds on the back foot. It's been a while since we've seen Groves fight in that manner, but we know it's in his locker, and I think he'd have to train to bring that style back out if he were to be fighting against a guy like Chris Eubank Jr. So I believe George Groves does represent much stiffer competition than Callum Smith. My concern with Groves is the engine. Frankly, I could see George Groves well up after 8 or 9 rounds. Well up. Let's say 9 rounds have gone. 3/4 of the fight is over. Would I be surprised if it was 8-1, 7-2, 6-3? Not at all. Eubank, he's not always the quickest starter. He likes to have a look at opponents from the outside. He likes to try and work his own jab in the early rounds. All of those rounds that are spent doing that, for me, are rounds that George Groves just picks up 1, 2, 3. Nothing more complex than that. I could see George Groves establishing a solid lead from the beginning of this fight. My concern is that Chris Eubank Jr. is just not a fighter you can run out of gas with, because he's so aggressive, he's so relentless, he's so come forward, and he's got such high volume. Look, we know Eubank Jr. is no George Foreman puncher, but the way George Groves looks in fights sometimes, he looks like he's out on his feet. He gets so tired, so exhausted, puts so much into being an explosive, dynamic fighter, he looks out on his feet. We saw it happen before in the first Carl Froch fight, where George Groves was absolutely dominating the matchup, and Carl Froch was able to come on strong and look so forceful, and Groves looked so out of it that the referee potentially unjustifiably stopped the fight. But I wouldn't have complete confidence that couldn't happen against George Groves, against a guy like Chris Eubank Jr., because I believe actually there's many similarities between Chris Eubank Jr. and Carl Froch, in the sense that they will be coming for all 12 rounds, they'll be fighting hard in the later ends of the fight, and they've clearly got immense stamina. I actually think Eubank Jr. has potentially even got a higher work rate than Froch, and he puts punches together better than Froch towards the end of fights. So, you know, if I was betting on George Groves in that fight, if George Groves didn't stop Eubank and Groves was well up with 2 or 3 rounds left, I still wouldn't be counting my chickens, because I only think Eubank would need 1 or 2 minutes with a tiring George Groves to be able to force a stoppage. And it would probably be a stoppage like we saw at the Reynolds-Quinlan fight. It would probably be a stoppage by accumulation, just with Eubank throwing a 20 punch combo, head body, body head, head body, left right, right left, you know, uppercuts, making the referee think that Groves was in severe, severe trouble. So for me, that's a fascinating fight. It really is. It's actually a fight that I make George Groves a slight favourite in. You know, I see it as a competitive fight. I'll probably make George Groves a 60-40 favourite. And the reason for that is because I actually think there's a chance that Groves wins the fight by stoppage early. Eubank is easy to hit. He's easy to counter. He's easy to time. And I think George Groves' power is severely underrated. I think people don't give the power George Groves hits with enough credit. But in my mind, George Groves is one of the hardest punchers at 168 pounds. And whilst Eubank hasn't shown chin concerns in his career today, I've seen nothing to make me think that he lives with a puncher like George Groves. And the way Eubank is sometimes susceptible to being caught with counters, I think would play in nicely to Groves' hands. I also think that Groves has the ability to box Eubank long, both on the front foot and on the back foot. And I think from the outside, Groves has a real substantial technical advantage and boxing advantage. So for me, the realistic threat in this fight to George Groves is him gassing. And I think that threat is exacerbated. That threat always exists in a George Groves fight, because George Groves is George Groves. But that fight is exacerbated for me because of the style that Chris Eubank Jr. employs. He's not someone who's going to let George Groves take rounds off. He's not someone who's going to give Groves his time and his space to get his jab working. He's someone who's going to grind away and make Groves work for 3 minutes of 12 rounds. And because of that, I think there's a high chance that Eubank Jr. could look to score a mid to late stoppage in the manner of which Carl Froch scored a mid to late stoppage against George Groves. So I think that's an intriguing fight. I make it a more competitive fight than the Callum Smith fight, largely because I believe Callum Smith and George Groves would look to take the fight with similar tactics, but I believe George Groves has more power, more variety, more back foot game, and just a bit more explosion and flow to his punches. So, you know, real good fight that. And funnily enough, there's a lot of rumours, I even discussed them on my channel before, that fight was potentially one that the Eubanks were discussing with Groves as, you know, a pay-per-view headliner for ITV. Now clearly they're going to have to put their hands deeper in their pockets to afford an opponent like George Groves. And I guess that will depend on how successful their pay-per-views have been, which is something that we'll cover as and when details are officially released, rather than just the current rumours circulating on social media. Finally, let's talk James Degale Eubank Jr. In my opinion, possibly the most intriguing matchup of all three. Why is it the most intriguing? For me, Degale's the number one super middleweight. And because James Degale himself is a very unpredictable fighter. For me, James Degale should have the highest chance of beating Chris Eubank Jr. of all the names on the list. In fact, for me, if all of these four fought each other in a Super 6 or Super 4 competition, if you put a gun to my head, I'd say James Degale's the one to come out on top. For me, Degale is a fighter who should bring everything to the ring. He's got underrated power. He's got underrated technique. In my opinion, he's got an underrated jab. He's got real underrated outside boxing skills. He's a superb mover. He's immensely awkward and throws punches from crazy angles that people just don't see coming. He's shown the capability to be an elite inside fighter. He's shown a good chin in his career today. Degale is a fighter who, for me, should have everything. Degale is a fighter who can be front foot, who can be back foot, who can be orthodox, who can be southpaw, who can be inside, who can be outside. He's exactly the kind of fighter we like on this channel. Versatile, something who can adapt, someone who can bring different looks to different opponents. Having said that, doubts remain over James Degale. He's made a lot harder work of recent fights than he should have done. He's got all of this versatility in his locker and arsenal. We know that for a fact, guys who've been following him since he turned pro. The problem is he doesn't use them and he fades in fights. For me, there's no reason James Degale shouldn't enjoy the kind of success on the outside that Billy Joe Saunders enjoyed on the outside against Chris Eubank Jr. I believe Degale is every ounce as slick as Saunders. Obviously, he's a bigger man. Obviously, he hits harder than Saunders. For me, he's arguably a better mover than Saunders as well. Maybe he's even more awkward and unorthodox than Saunders. And I suspect that if this fight was fought over 6 rounds purely on the outside, James Degale would win the fight 6-0. But of course, that's not how boxing works at this level. It's fought over 12 rounds and it's fought at all sorts of distances. And for me, James Degale's fatal flaw is his tendency to take rounds off in the middle of the fights. Is it a psychological issue? Is it a laziness issue? Is it a training issue? Is it a conditioning issue? I don't know. I can't work it out. People have their own opinions. But I've accepted that tendency about James Degale to take rounds off and to fade from fights is part of his game. Degale's in his 30s. Degale's at the top level of the sport and he's still doing this. You know, I've got no confidence that it's something that's going to be worked out before the end of his career. So when considering James Degale fights, I think we have to factor in that it's inevitable he's going to take rounds off in the middle of the fight. I think another thing to factor in is I've talked about how great his outside game is and how he should school Chris Eubank Jr. from the outside, and he should. But he doesn't use that outside game. You know, Degale's a guy who moves around a hell of a lot and looks for one punch, weird power punch type fights. He almost fights now like a David Haye style fighter, an ambush fighter. Remember David Haye versus Nikolai Valuev, someone who drifts around on the outside, looking for that opportunity to spring in with an unorthodox power punch. That's kind of how Degale operates sometimes. If Degale went back to boxing 101, boxed Eubank Jr. from range, I think Degale schools him. But we've got to look at the stats. The stats are James Degale only landed a handful of jabs against Badu Jack in their entire 12-round fight. The jab was an ineffective weapon for James Degale, largely because he just didn't decide to utilise it. You know, and it's frustrating talking about it as a Degale fan. I believe Degale should beat Chris Eubank Jr. 90 times out of 100. But I don't have the confidence in James Degale. As someone who's been a fan of his for years on this channel, I don't have the confidence in him to commit to saying that Degale's definitely going to win. Don't get me wrong, I make him a favourite, but can I say he's definitely going to win? You know, if Degale spends a fight swapping bombs with Chris Eubank Jr., getting into a war with Chris Eubank Jr., getting into a fight in the pocket with Chris Eubank Jr., and Degale's got inside game, more than Groves and Callum Smith for my money, then it's a more competitive fight. It is a more competitive fight for my money, definitely. My worry is that if Degale and Eubank Jr. get involved for a scrap from the first bell, and they may do because there's dislike there, then by the time Degale has his 3 or 4 rounds off, round 7 to 10, Chris Eubank Jr. is going to be pouring it on at that stage. And for me, there is a risk. There is a risk that, you know, Degale will look like he doesn't want it. Like he's out on his feet. You know, I almost felt that against Badu Jack at times in their fight. And whilst Chris Eubank Jr. maybe doesn't have the technique and size and strength of Badou Jack, what he does have is the work rate. And that work rate caused Degale real issues against Badou Jack. Real issues. And I think that's why Eubank Jr. fundamentally is such an exciting fighter to watch. Is there's so many fighters who fight in exactly the same manner and who adopt exactly the same tactics when boxing. You know, we've talked about it here, like, you know, James Degale being elite on the outside, George Groves having the best jab in British boxing, Callum Smith being the tall, rangy guy who likes to fight long. Chris Eubank Jr., whether you rate him or not, creates a stylistic kryptonite to a lot of these guys. Now, it may be James Degale's a good inside fighter. He's a big man, bigger than Eubank. It may be that James Degale's got the game to completely negate Chris Eubank Jr.'s inside game and to school him on the inside as well as the outside. But my concern with Degale runs deeper than that. And whilst I have every confidence Degale will be ahead at the time of him taking his middle rounds off, I just have severe concerns. Chris Eubank Jr. is a relentless steam train of a fighter. And I do have concerns about James Degale getting worn down. You know, can I see Chris Eubank Jr. being the better fighter on the outside? No. Can I see him being the better fighter on the inside? No. Can I see him being the better fighter defensively? No. Can I see him being the better fighter, you know, in terms of boxing technique and pedigree and power? No. But can I see James Degale taking rounds off in the late part of the fight and the referee think he's giving up the ghost? Yes, I can. And that's a real concern for me. Because of that, whilst I say Degale has the attributes to beat Chris Eubank Jr. 90 times out of 100, I'd probably only be picking him to win 70 times out of 100, because I believe the style that Eubank Jr. brings gives him a chance. You know, to compare it, we talk about David Price having a puncher's chance in every fight he's in. That's because David Price is a 6'8" guy who punches like a, you know, like a bazooka. In a very different way, Chris Eubank Jr. has a live chance in every fight he's in, because he brings such aggression, relentlessness, work, and, you know, the sort of tendency to sit on your chest, take away your room and just grind you down. So many fighters can't deal with that. So what Eubank Jr. brings is so different that, in a not dissimilar way to David Price, you know, granted we're talking about very different styles, very different fighters, but Chris Eubank Jr. is live in any fight. Because if a fighter's got a concern about fighting on the inside, if a fighter's got concern about work rate or fighting for 12 rounds, he's going to be that guy who can expose that hole in their game. You know, for me, that is really why it's such an intriguing place in this division. So there you are. Of those 4 fights, you know, just to reiterate, I'll probably make Eubank a slight favourite over Callum Smith, even though I admit Callum Smith has huge advantages. And it's a close fight. I make Groves a slight favourite over Eubank, although Groves' tendency to fatigue in fights, you know, is a big concern. Similarly, I make James Degale the most substantial favourite over Eubank, because I believe his well-roundedness and completeness in terms of attributes would make him the hardest guy for Eubank to work out. But again, James Degale's fatal flaw makes it a competitive fight for me. So let's just hope some of these fights get made, people, because if they do, it's truly going to be an exciting time for British boxing. And, you know, it's going to be, you know, I don't know about you, but there'll be butterflies in my game, talking about, you know, getting ready to watch these fights live. I'll tell you, very, very exciting stuff. Look, I didn't intend this to be as long a video, but once again, it's rattled on. We're nearly on 40 minutes. Last time I did this, I said, let's do a little experiment and see how many people watch to the end. So I said a particular fighter's name. At the time it was Prince Nassim Hamed, and I said comment something about Prince Nassim Hamed if you've watched to the end. So let's do a little bit of a test. this week, and let's go with George Foreman. And the person who puts the funniest comment on George Foreman, I'll give you a shout out on next week's podcast or something like that nature. So if you've watched till this point, fair play to you for sticking with me for 40 minutes. And leave your comments on George Foreman. I want to know what percentage chance you're giving Eubank Jr. of being successful against those 3 opponents. To reiterate for myself, Eubank 65, Callum Smith 35, Eubank 40, Grove 60, Eubank 25, Degale 75. Those are my percentages. Leave your percentages in the comments section below. Which fight would you most like to see? Who do you think would come out on top if the 4 guys fought in a Super 6 style tournament? I want to know your thoughts, people. Leave them in the comments section below. Do you think these fights will happen, or do you think we're more likely to see Eubank taking on the lower domestic fighters, the Rocky Fieldings, the John Ryders, the Martin Murrays? You know, what's your suspicion? Subscriber numbers are up. Please take the time to hit subscribe. I'm still averaging about 55% of my views from non-subscribers, and that's something I want to change. I really want to try and build subscriber numbers so I can grow out the channel and take things more seriously in the years to come. So if you haven't already subscribed, please do take the time to hit that subscribe button now. As always, really appreciate it if you click the thumbs up button. That really supports the channel and means these videos get a lot more visibility. So thanks if you're one of those people who always clicks the thumbs up button. I know there's a lot of you out there, and genuinely I appreciate it. Anyway guys, I've rambled on for long enough, 41 minutes all in all. Thanks very much for watching my video, and hope you enjoyed it.